tiempos, reinventarnos, desaparecer para crear nuevos.
Hello, I'm John Southern, and welcome to the SCI-Arc Channel. I'm here in conversation with Gregory Crewdson, the Director of Graduate Studies in Photography at the Yale School of Art. His newest body of work, Cathedral the Pines, recently premiered at the Gagosian Gallery in New York. Gregory, thank you for coming to SCI-Arc.
It's my pleasure.
I was curious about how your work really embraced different levels of production. So in the beginning, it was you working alone, and more recently, you've taken on crews and had to pull permits to close streets and all these things that I don't think people normally associate with photography. They associate it with cinematography. But what struck me about that was that it was very similar to what architects do. We ultimately have to go out in the world, explore a site, come up with a vision, and bring that to fruition through collaboration.
No matter what level of production, I feel like I do have a singular story to tell in visual form. I've always been interested in using light and color to tell that story. At its height, Beneath the Roses, there were 100 people involved in that body of work from beginning to end. And I do think the struggle is, in the end, is to try to find this, almost despite the enormous production, to have, in the end, a singular voice.
Most people would associate photography with a solitary act. In some interviews that I've heard with you, you've talked a little bit about how now you almost operate in front of the camera during production.
Despite the large production, at the core, photography is a singular act. It is a lonely act. Just the very act of putting a camera in front of our eyes is an act of isolating yourself from the world. It's an act of separation. So I think that most all photographers are drawn to the medium by a certain kind of aloneness or certainly a kind of voyeuristic impulse of wanting to see something that's forbidden or secret in some sense. When we're shooting, I want to have a direct relationship to the thing in front of me. So the camera is a kind of hindrance in a way. I have a kind of alienated relationship to the medium.
In what way?
Well, I'm certainly not like one of those kind of photographers who always has the camera, is always ready to take the picture. I started off by saying I consider myself a storyteller, and then I use pictures to tell that story. So when I'm location scouting or when I'm planning a picture in the early stages, I never have a camera with me. I'm just like looking and trying to imagine what the story might be.
You've also talked about your pictures as being moments, and I don't think for a lot of people that necessarily conjures narrative. And Are all these moments, do they have a kind of continuity for you?
I am very much aligned with this single moment. I don't have much interest in what happens before or what happens after. It's a very kind of condensed narrative. It's a story that asks more questions than it answers. I consider that limitation a strength because I can fully invest in the single moment and make it as mysterious and as beautiful as I can.
I think that moment, and I was reminded of it when I was examining all the photographs from Cathedral of the Pines. The idea of place is very important, it seems, in your work.
Well, yes. I mean, for me, location, that's sort of central to my pictures. It might be central to all photographers. In my particular case, I have a landscape or setting that captures my imagination. And almost all of my pictures exclusively have been photographed in a series of towns in the Berkshires. And I think we could trace that back to that's where my parents had a country house. However, in a certain way, it could be anywhere. I'm just using that place as a kind of backdrop to create my own story, some kind of aspect of the American vernacular that I feel like I'm aligned to.
Is it nostalgic in any way?
I mean, I love that word because for me, the way I read nostalgia is it's a longing for something that never was. It's nostalgic in a way that almost a kind of perversion of that in a certain way of like trying to heal a wound or reconnect to a moment.
In the interiors that you generated, struck me when I started to look at details how there really is no contemporary in the work at all. The phones are rotary dial or they're push button, or it can't be pegged at a time.
I do not as you say, like want any indicators of contemporary life. I want everything in the picture to feel ordinary and familiar, but outside of time. But
is that a kind of liberating element for you, for imagining the scene, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's certainly not like a period piece,
right?
You know? So I'm not referring to, like, let's say Mad Men, particular time period. The best way I can describe it, it feels like nondescript. So I want all the spaces, all the objects in the space, all my subjects and the clothes they wear, and the cars and the houses, all to feel ordinary but aged down and slightly musty. So there's nothing, it all feels kind of like it's been there, it's going to sort of stay in that kind of circumstance. It probably references in a certain way my childhood, sure, but in a vague way. It's more like the kind of iconography of that time period. You know, I use these nondescript cars, for instance, that we have to find and sort of bring into the picture. So we have an intern whose sole job it is to drive around the towns and look for these nondescript cars.
So I'm curious, you know, it's never going to be a monster truck or, you know, there's never an extreme. There's kind of a consistent smoothness to it. So I'm wondering how you use that in the work to backdrop your subjects.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the monster truck is a really good metaphor generally. Like, there will never be the monster truck of anything in my pictures, because it's really important that everything in my pictures feels ordinary and not spectacular. The landscapes, the houses, the cars, the subjects, all of it. Like, because I'm trying to create something beautiful from that. So I want a tension between the kind of seemingly ordinary drabness of an interior and the beauty of the picture. So there's that using light and color to transform and make it in its own way spectacular, like a kind of spectacular drabness.
Your work's often been described as dark, even grotesque in natural wonder photographs. The more recent, in Cathedral of the Pines, the grotesque is there. And I'm wondering, as you've immersed yourself in these rural landscapes, which I think are part of Americana, I completely agree. I grew up in the South. As you've moved from natural wonder and into Cathedral of the Pines, how has the grotesque continued to manifest itself, or the darkness?
Well, in Cathedral of the Pines, it was 5 years in the making, actually, and did represent, at the early stages, a very dark period of my life. My ambition there was actually to make the most hopeful and positive pictures I've ever made. And in a certain way, they are that, but in another way, they're still maintain a certain kind of darkness. But that line, that tension that I'm really looking for is that perfect symmetry between, like, beauty and sadness, let's say. At the core of it, I think these pictures are about trying to find the light and trying to find a sense of possibility. I think that's the theme in these pictures.
I guess in the way that you conceive of the images when you're thinking about them in your head, does the idea of the sort of dark or grotesque actually come into that kind of discussion once it leaves your head? Is it still part of that?
This is something that you know, it might be hard to make sense of, but, like, my main preoccupation in terms of making the pictures are formal issues. It's like trying to find the perfect frame and, like, the tension between interior and exterior space and lighting issues. And the darkness that you refer to, which is clearly there, is something I'm just less conscious of. I mean, I think that's where the true kind of meaning of my pictures reside, but it's something I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about, really. I allow that part just to exist and kind of bubble up from beneath the surface of things.
Maybe Twilight being a good body of work to compare to Cathedral of the Pines, and looking at the sort of spectrum, it seems like the reliance or attention to surreal or extreme has receded into the background. It's become more about, I don't want to say hidden danger, but hidden qualities of terror within nature.
If you look through my pictures from earlier to later, there has been this slow attempt to kind of drain any kind of literal narrative out of the pictures and have them be more kind of elusive, more open-ended, more psychological. And in these pictures, the Cathedral the Pine pictures, certainly they're the sort of most visible manifestation of that. And it's also, in these pictures, I want them to feel more like paintings and less like films. Although we've used all the same cinematic production, it's done very, just as much restraint and quietude as possible.
What was interesting to sort of experience the work in its entirety before we had a chance to talk today was again, connections to architecture in some way, in the way we as designers see space. And if I was to use an example, Beneath the Roses, the incorporation of the soundstage where the architecture becomes the framing device for the shot, versus the sort of shots of from hover, which are ultimately field conditions. In Cathedral of the Pines, it's architecture is still there, it's still present, but it seems now to be less as a framing device. The architecture no longer seems, or you don't seem to be as reliant on the architecture to do the kind of work of composition.
Well, one very big distinction between Beneath the Roses and Cathedral of the Pines is all the interiors were done on sound stages in that work, and I worked with art directors and with a big crew to build these things. In these new pictures, it's all on location, so we're dealing with real physical spaces and sometimes very small spaces, and so they're, just by the very nature of the spaces, much more constrained and less operatic, less sort of large-scale constructions. But to me, it was a great pleasure to work on location because, well, firstly because of that great dynamic between interior and exterior space. Just the unexpected surprises of being in real places. But if you trace all of my work in terms of architecture, I think qualities of the home appear in every single picture, pretty much. You know, the domestic architecture as a kind of psychological meaning of whether it's claustrophobia or voyeurism or qualities of discomfort. The window or the doorway or all these kind of framing devices occurs and reoccurs throughout the pictures. There is an attempt to try to understand where you are in relationship to home.
Gregory, thank you for talking to us today and for coming to SCI-Arc.
It's great, I really enjoyed it, and thanks for your questions and thoughts on the work.
Thank you all for tuning in to the SCI-Arc channel. We'll see you soon.
Para adaptarnos a los nuevos tiempos, reinventarnos, desaparecer para crear un nuevo sistema moderno y